All right, everyone. Welcome to episode 21 of The One New Man. I'm here with my good buddy, John Myers, and co-host. And I'm very excited about today. We're going to actually do a little bit of a rehashing of John's life story. So, we have a lot of people that are kind of coming into the podcast that maybe aren't as connected to the work that John's done in the past. And I just think it'd be a good time to give some context for who the man is, John Myers.
It's scary, Chris. Very scary.
I know.
But we'll try anyway.
Yeah. So, so I think without further ado, John, why don't we just jump in here? And I've got a series of questions that we're going to just go through, and I want to hear. Going to put you on the hot seat. So the first one.
I just want to say this, Chris. If you ask me really hard questions, I'm going to ask you some back. Just so
that's fun. I think we know each other's. We know where the bodies are hidden.
That's true.
Well, this one's a bit of a slow ball, I guess you could say. But okay, so just tell me a little bit about where you were born, what your family was like, just what a little bit about your upbringing.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I was born in Williamsport, Pennsylvania. You probably know, you've heard my story or parts of it before, Chris. So you know what Williamsport is famous for?
Oh, I think I should know this. It's not oil.
Is
it? It's not casinos either.
No, it's not. Well, you have to talk to our son Shimon.
Yeah, right.
No. Actually, Williamsport is known because it is the home of Little League baseball, and actually, every year when they have the Little League World Series, it's held in Williamsport, Pennsylvania. It's a beautiful place. It's in the Allegheny Mountains of central Pennsylvania, and you'll see if you watch Little League World Series, it's just beautiful. Anyway, So yes, that is where I was born, and I think I was in some ways probably a little bit of a surprise. My parents married in their 40s, and so I may be off by a year here, but I think my mother was 43 when I was born, and my father was 45, and so I am and was an only child, and that's one of the reasons I'm as crazy as I am. But I couldn't help it, and so both my parents are Jewish. I was raised in a Reformed Jewish home, which is kind of obviously it's different for everybody that is in that kind of environment, but I would say it's somewhat similar to being a nominal Christian,
like a Catholic, maybe.
Well, I'm not knocking Catholics. They're very sincere Catholics.
Sure.
No, but it's like somebody that's a Christian because whatever their parents went to this denomination or that denomination, and they celebrate Christmas. Of course, Jesus has little to do with it in their lives or minds, and so I did have religious instruction, Jewish religious instruction. I was bar mitzvahed. We had a Hanukkah menorah with little lights on it in our window. When it came to Hanukkah time, and so you would light the little light depending on what night it was of the 8 nights of Hanukkah, et cetera. And my uncle, who was a judge in a neighboring town, he usually was the one that hosted a Passover Seder. So we had a Passover Seder. So, but in terms of my heart, or let's say my relationship with God, it wasn't associated with that. It was really more of a cultural Judaism,
that makes sense,
than a religious Judaism.
Yeah. So,
and now you didn't. Now let me finish. This is very important. And not only was Williamsport the home Little League baseball, but I loved Little League baseball. So I was a pitcher and a shortstop and on the All-Star team. And I pitched the first, All-Star game in the field where they had the Little League World Series, and we lost. Okay, that's it.
I don't think I knew that, actually.
You wouldn't have. I never said that.
I don't think I knew that.
Yeah,
so okay, because your family too, they were like judges and lawyers and doctors. Were they kind of? Is that right?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I was definitely the black sheep if you get to that. But definitely, CPA, my father, of course, was a CPA, but a lot of lawyers, judges, college professors, university professors, et cetera. And for instance, my mother's twin. Her name was Cecilia. Her twin's name was Beatrice, so they called her B and C. And B, my mother's sister, married Abe, so he was A, B, and C. Anyway, he was a judge in a neighboring town, 25 minutes away from us. His son, who was my closest, he and his sister, closest relatives, I shouldn't say was and is a judge on the First Circuit Court of Appeals that meets in Boston. He was nominated by Clinton, and his daughter. So his daughter is a judge. So again, his father was a judge. He's a judge, a justice really, and his daughter is also a judge. And when I said he sort of is and isn't, he's in retirement age, but the way it works, as a circuit court judge is you sort of formally retire so somebody can take your place, but then you continue to sit and they use you in various different circuit courts.
Got it. Okay.
That's my background.
Yeah. That's that sounds like a very Jewish background.
Yes. Overachievers.
Yeah, that's right. So tell me this. Was there any conversation about Jesus or Christianity in your house, even like a negative, or was it just kind of an ambivalence or just not really talked about at all?
Well, that's an interesting question, actually, because my mother, she had certain challenges in her life. And I think this was even influenced by her mother. But my mother was associated with Christian Science. And of course, we don't have to go down that rabbit hole. But so she actually had a Christian Science. Well, I think she had a New Testament in the house. She had a book by, I think it was Mary Baker Eddy, I think was the founder of Christian Science, something like that. And so I know that was a part of her life. But I think in some ways, I don't know if that's the right word to say, she was ashamed of it. But being Jewish and kind of having that orientation, she never talked about it. I did meet a couple people that were influencers in her life that way, but really, like I said, it was there, Chris. It wasn't really talked about. Jesus certainly wasn't talked about. Even the potential of faith in Jesus, or Jesus being the Messiah, and that's not exactly Christian Science anyway.
Sure, no.
Yeah.
Okay, that's very interesting. Very interesting. Okay, so tell me, when the 60s and the 70s were going on, where were you in kind of the heyday of your life? Because were you at Berkeley or UCLA at some point?
Well, at one point I was, not at UCLA, at Berkeley, but yes. I mean, I was greatly influenced by all of that. As I told you, I was the black sheep,
Right.
So whereas my close cousin who I mentioned, he went to Haverford College and then Yale Law School and so on. I went through the book, that shows you the different schools, the universities and so on that you could go to and the various courses they offer, et cetera. Well, guess which one I picked? The University of Hawaii. I mean, seriously, I just thought, well, University of Hawaii is 6,000 miles away from home. And I can go to school and live on the beach or whatever I was going to do. So I, and this was again, during the 60s. So that would have been, I graduated from high school in 67. So this was the height,
like the peak.
Oh man, of the 60s. So I went out there and, my first course was introduced to me by a guy living in the same house I was living. It was a crazy place, Chris. I mean, this was somebody divided up a house that had 4 bedrooms into 12 bedrooms, with these thin walls in between them, and this crazy bunch of people living there. And one of the guys was one of the biggest drug pushers in Honolulu. Anyway, so that was my number one course, my introduction into psychedelics, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
So. Now I forgot.
What kind of music were you listening to during this time? Were you in your Bob Dylan phase?
Yeah. I mean, listen, I listened to all of it. Everybody, of course, listened to the Beatles and the Stones and et cetera. But my orientation was more toward folk music. So Bob Dylan for sure, and then Joan Baez and Joni Mitchell, and what was this guy's name now?
Van Halen, Van Morris.
Who was that?
Would you listen to Van Morris at all?
Was it Van Morris or Morrison? I don't know.
Van Morris. Maybe it was Van Morris. Yeah.
Apparently, I didn't listen to him.
Yeah, that's
James Taylor. I don't know, but it's all,
okay.
Yeah, and Simon and Garfunkel, and yeah.
So you're out on the beach in Hawaii, listening to folk music and taking psychedelics at this point, kind of caught up, just being hoping that you're not going to be sent to Vietnam. Is that basically?
Definitely hoping that. Yeah, no, for sure. I mean but yes, and of course there was so much going on, Chris. Let me just back up for a second, because I don't know, how much do you know about the '60s, Chris? I mean, obviously you know the music.
Yeah, I mean, I know. I've studied at different points in my life. I'm at some point we're going to talk about the Jesus People movement and just kind of what was going on with that. And so, I've studied Lonnie Frisbee's life and some of the guys that were really influential during that era. But I mean, it's culturally iconic. But I'd love to hear kind of what you want to share.
Let's just talk about a few of the major things that were going on. I mean, look, for sure, Western civilization, and particularly United States society, was shaking, Chris. The foundations, of American life were shaking at that point. I mean, first of all, early in the '60s, JFK, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, was assassinated, and then his brother Robert Kennedy, who was running for the Democratic nomination for president, was assassinated after that. Martin Luther King was assassinated, shortly after Robert Kennedy was assassinated. The cities, the inner cities of America were on fire at that point, with race riots, et cetera. We are in the middle of the Vietnam War. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I think it was 52,800 U.S. soldiers were killed in Vietnam. But it was a war that was never declared by our Congress. And so, and it was also, a lot of people point back to this, even as it relates to what's happening in Israel today and the effect of the previous administration, in relation to Israel. And people just say, America's forgotten how to win wars. And it goes back to that period of time, because the United States could have ended that war in a couple of days, but you had all these people dying. And again, it was an undeclared war that we weren't entirely trying to win as much as we possibly could. And so, where we had soldiers going over there and dying, you had students burning their draft cards, on street corners and going to Canada to avoid the draft. And so there was so much happening, Chris. And I think in many, many ways, the American dream was being questioned by our generation. And let me just say this before I get off of that, because this relates to me personally. I mean, as you mentioned before, you asked me about our family, and, a very, very successful family, in terms of occupation, in terms of, the generation of wealth and so on and so forth. But I know for me, when I looked at all of that, I just said, is this all there is? I mean, there was a song, actually came out in the '80s, but it applies to this. It was looking for love in all the wrong places, And so, but the question was, is there more to just being born, being raised, being educated, getting a job, getting married, having children, buying a house, having a mortgage, growing old and dying? I mean, is there more purpose in life than just that scenario? And I think that was happening really in the generation itself.
Yeah. So that's really interesting. So tell me this, do you, because obviously, some other things are going on. You're having the sexual revolution. You're having really kind of the first, second waves of feminism, which I'm sure is creating very interesting dynamics between men and women, which is a huge component. Has the last 8 years in America felt anything like what you were experiencing then? I mean, is there, obviously the triggers are different, but has there been a similar sense of kind of angst or unrest, or just, I don't know, I'm just curious.
That's a good question, Chris. I would say it's similar in the sense of losing our way, and what I mean, just losing contact with the basic, most simple principles of life. I mean, if you get to the place where you can't tell the difference between a man and a woman, it doesn't get any simpler than that, and then, now I think much more so, you have the breakdown of the family unit, and more than 50% of children, in the United States are raised in single parent homes. And there wasn't, so all I'm saying is I think the issues were somewhat different, but I think in terms of the eroding of these basic values, very similar. You didn't have, obviously there was homosexuality, but not nearly to the degree there is now. In terms of trans, I don't think I ever heard the term or thought about that. I don't, probably existed in some degree at that point.
Hayden Ashbury, if you were in San Francisco, I'm sure.
Well, I was there. I was there, but those weren't really the main thing. Now, in terms, you want to talk about the sexual revolution. I mean, that's that for sure. And that was a very big issue in my life. I don't know if we're going to talk about that, but I mean, sexual sin, immorality was a major, major issue in my life. And there were seeds sown, I think, even in the background, my parents, if we get into that, or my parent in one sense, that sowed into that. But that was a major stronghold. And one of the things when we get to that actually God used to draw me to himself.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Well, why don't you talk a little bit about that? I know that there's specifically a rooftop story that I think was pretty influential in your journey, wasn't it?
I can talk. Yeah, I certainly can talk about that, Chris. But let me just back up for a second and talk about the sexual sin part, because I think this is something that's I think really affecting to a very great degree today's generation in a different way. I think in some ways there's probably less sexual activity and more pornography, et cetera, but it's really the same spirit in many ways. In my life, I just want to go back for a second, because I think this is very, very relevant in the lives of men today, but also some women as well. And that is that, as I said, I grew up as an only child. My mother and father are wonderful people. I just adore my father. My father's just the most wonderful man, and may his memory be blessed, forever. But there was a stronghold in his life, and that was pornography. And this is something I would not talk about this in any way to dishonor my father, except that I think it's very important that people understand what I'm about to say, and it's the reason I even bring it up. Now, he never talked to me about this. I mean, or exposed me to this. I wasn't abused in it. It's none of that. But those materials were in our home, for one thing. And in those days, Chris, I mean, today, if you don't want to be influenced by pornography, you need to run from it, because if you just push the wrong button, or whatever on your phone, then boom, something's going to pop up in your face. But in those days, you had to look for it. It wasn't as prevalent. My guess is my father probably had to go to New York City to some underground store to buy the kind of books he had and that sort of stuff.
So you really had to go out of your way to get a verse. Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, obviously it's always been there, but nothing like the proliferation that exists today. So anyway, the reason I even bring that up is that when I was a very small child, I don't remember how old, but let's say 3 years old. I remember, Chris, having dreams, sexual dreams. I mean, and sort of sick, sexual dreams, which I won't even describe at this point. I didn't even know what those things were. I mean, I had no idea, of any of those things. But what I believe, and this is the main point why I even bring all of this up. I mean, this had a profound effect on me. If we fast forward to, once I hit puberty and my teen years, and before I became a believer, and so on. I mean, I was driven sexually, Chris. I mean, it wasn't, I wasn't a predator in one sense. I never forced myself on anybody, but this was the driving force in my life until the Lord got a hold of me. But what I want to say is that though my father never in any way overtly connected me to any of those things, I believe that when you do that, when you open yourself up to those forces, which are truly demonic forces, that let's just say, for instance, you're today, you're in your office and you're checking that stuff out. You have a family at home and so on, but nobody really knows what you're doing. Or at home, your wife goes to bed, your children are in bed, and you're on your computer accessing that stuff. And you think, well, I know it's not right, but I'm not really doing anything. I'm just sort of watching this stuff and nobody really knows about it. What you don't understand is that you are opening up doors in the spiritual realm that are not only going to affect your life and bring destruction into your life, but it's also going to open doors in your environment. And I truly believe that's what happened, Chris. That spirit was in our home and affected me as a little child when I really couldn't act upon it. But eventually, I hit teenage years, then, it came to fruition. And to me, that's serious. It's scary. And let me just end with this, because this is a little bit of a rant here. If you're listening to this podcast, or if you know anybody else that's struggling in this area, I'm not saying these things to condemn anybody, but I am saying get help. If you're a believer and you're struggling with this, go to someone else, confess it, pray with them and get help. So not only do you not destroy your life, but those that you care about.
Totally. I agree with all that, John. I think about, I don't know, when was the last time you saw the movie, The Two Towers?
Say again?
When was the last time you saw the movie, The Two Towers, the Lord of the Rings series?
Yeah, I don't. It's been a while, Chris.
Well, there's at the end of the movie, there's this this fortress that the world of men have kind of built called it's called Helm's Deep, and it's just impenetrable, completely impenetrable. But there's this one like small sewage area where the orcs figure out they take this kind of explosive device in this small pocket, and then it blows the entire wall up, and then now they have access to the entire. And I often think about. This scene, I feel like, is a perfect visual of what pornography is in your home and even sexual sin. Because you're right, I think a lot of men justify it saying, well, it's better than having an affair or no one's going to know, or it's just this kind of small thing. But in the spiritual realm, like the access that now you're opening up, because really you're supposed to be the priest of your home as a man, and you are supposed to protect spiritually your home. And so when you open up this vulnerability, which is what you're doing spiritually, and I think in the dynamics between you and your wife, I know that women can feel this, even if they're not even sure what they're feeling, they're going to feel a disconnect. And emotionally, they're going to feel a disconnect in the spirit. You're talking about as a child what it did to you. So, there's so many layers to this that it's a very, very serious issue. And it completely flies in the face of our calling as men to be protectors of the home. And so when you do that, you're absolutely right. You're creating this massive vulnerability. So that's really interesting. So this becomes then a major issue, like in your kind of early 20s and really up until you get saved, right?
Absolutely. It was, that when you talk about this, the sin in my life, for sure, Chris. I mean, I was driven, as I said, it's not that I ever forced myself, on a woman, but, just countless experiences, with different women in my life. Obviously, that's not something that I feel good about at all. I'm very, very grateful to the Lord for cleansing those sins and setting me free from all of that. But it was a major area of darkness. So immorality and also substance abuse. Yeah, I know. I mean, that may be something that you want to talk about in your past.
Well, we both have these issues, and I remember being in Zechariah at one point, and Zechariah is before the hall of the Lord, and he's kind of in these tattered, disgusting clothes, and essentially the Lord takes this coal and he purifies Zechariah's mouth, and the whole context of this is he's taking Zechariah and basically taking this dirty clothing, dirty man, and purifying him and saying, if you will be my spokesman, I will send you the nations, essentially, and this is, you must purify it. Like there's this whole, but I always felt like this, and it talks about him being a stick that was grabbed from the flame. And I really feel like that was God's role in my life. Like there was, he grabbed me from the fire, and I think you feel the same way.
No, there's no question. And so absolutely grateful to the Lord for that, Chris, for sure.
So then tell me, tell me about the dream, because I know that this dream, I think you were on a specific kind of trip that you can talk about on the rooftop, but didn't you see a woman in the glass or something that was really that kind of connected.
You're jumping ahead, by the way, in the story. So I will just say, because you've mentioned the rooftop thing, and let me just mention those things very, very briefly. But it's interesting, Chris, because the Scripture talks about angels, as ministering spirits to those who are to come unto salvation. I really believe that there's a tremendous grace of God on our lives many times before we know Him, before we submitted our lives to Him, and so on, even to keep us alive until the time in which we will submit our lives to the Lord. And as I mentioned, we don't have to go into great detail on all this stuff, but because I was a drug abuser, et cetera, honestly, Chris, I could easily have been dead, by the time I was 21 years old, and I, at one point on an LSD trip, I was living on the North Shore of Oahu between two of the most famous surfing beaches at that point, Waimea Bay and the Bonsai Pipeline. But where we lived, it was a shore break. And you don't surf a shore break because you'll be driven, into the shore. The break has to be out. The waves have to be out further, and so, but it happened to be a storm, surf that day. I think the waves were probably 10 or 15 feet, major waves. And I was on an LSD trip and I got sucked out into the water. And I don't want to go into all the details, but I almost drowned. And instead of being smashed into the beach, which would have broken my back or my neck or killed me, a wave literally just threw me forward out and I rolled up on the beach. And just one time, God spared my life. Other one was what they call a bad trip. I don't know if you're very familiar with that terminology.
Yeah, unfortunately, yes.
Okay. Well, it was another LSD trip. I was at Pratt Institute, which is an art institute
in New York, right?
Yeah,
Brooklyn.
New York. Yeah. And so bad trip, meaning that basically, the walls are melting, people's faces are melting, and it's just a horrible, demonic kind of experience. And a quote friend of mine, a guy I was with at that point, who was also, doing LSD, saw what was going on with me and apparently wanted to help me. So he took me up on the rooftop. We were in a dormitory building. I think it was probably 20 or 25 stories high. It took me up on the rooftop of that building. It was a flat roof. And I there's a whole story about this, which I won't go into, but I have a little difficulty with heights in the sense that, I'm not a kind of guy that can stand on the edge of a roof, and then just stand there and be fine. That would not be easy for me. But he told me that I stood on the edge of that rooftop. This is a 20 or 25 story building, no guardrail, and looked over and then looked back at him and smiled, looked over for a couple hours. Chris, in those days, some of us thought we could fly. And there is I was totally psychotic. I don't remember this at all. But literally, I could easily have obviously been dead. And the funny thing about that is, and then I'm going to come back to the dream, by the way, but the funny thing about that is that I remember kind of coming back to my consciousness. I was sitting on the ground, probably 7:00 in the morning, as sun is rising outside of that building. And the thought that came to me, and I'm not going to say this in a religious context, it's not that, but the thought came to me, it's almost like I've been born again. Now, I don't mean that again biblically, but I had the sense that I had a second chance, that somehow or other something happened, but it wasn't the end of me. And now I have another chance. Of course, I went on in darkness after that, but it was the grace of God that kept me, Chris. Do you want me to talk about my dream now? Because that was...
I just always found that so interesting because I think that... you and I have had a similar dream in this regard. And I don't know if yours was a dream or if you were actually on substances when this happened, but the color of that I thought related to the sexual component.
It does. It does.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, let's just fast forward very fast, and then we can go back to stuff if you want to, so people understand sort of where I am in my life at this point. Actually, this could open up a lot of. This could actually open up a lot of details. So let me see if Chris. One of my gifts is not brevity. I don't know if you've noticed.
No, I know that. I know that.
So I'm going to have to do the. Lord help me here, because so. Fast forward, I'm back from Hawaii. I'm back in Williamsport, Pennsylvania. I connected with the lovely woman who has now been my wife for 53 years. We just celebrated our anniversary, about a week ago, a little more than a week ago. But anyway, we are at this point living together. And she is the owner of a health food store in central Pennsylvania, which was not very lucrative in the 60s, in Appalachia. But anyway, and we're living together, before being married, which was to me, this was a huge commitment. I mean, we talked about, my immorality and all that, but actually to make the commitment to live with somebody, it's
right. And you're not saved at this point. You're not.
No,
saved.
I am definitely not saved. So I'm not recommending this as a lifestyle, to say the least. So, okay. So anyway, we haven't talked about the Jesus revolution, the Jesus people and all that, but during the 60s, all this crazy stuff is going on. And meanwhile, you have what a lot of people have said is the greatest awakening, the greatest revival in American history, which was the Jesus people movement. And if we talk about that, that's a great, great topic. But so these Jesus people, a lot of whom are hippies. I was a hippie, by the way. If you look at me now, I have no hair. But back then, I had hair halfway down my back and all of that stuff. Anyway, so Jesus people, a lot of them were hippies. People were going out in the parks and preaching to them. And, it was the Wild West of Christianity at that point. And there was a lot of low-hanging fruit that was falling off the trees into the kingdom. And I was one of those. But so these Jesus people would come into the health food store where I used to hang out there sometimes, and they would preach the gospel. They're very, very bold and always talking about Jesus and all of that. And, as a Jew, number one, first of all, I was hostile to the gospel, Chris. I mean, really, I wasn't just negative. I was hostile. But the thing that was interesting about it is I could not stand what these people were saying, but I liked them. There was, and I believe it was the Holy Spirit. I mean, there was just life and love coming out of them. So what was happening was the Lord was drawing me in my heart, and my head was saying, forget it. I don't want anything to do with this. I didn't like the gospel, number one, because I'm a Jew. So, I've been inoculated. Don't tell me about Jesus. Number two, I thought it was, I thought it was really dogmatic. I had gone through this whole thing. I didn't even tell you about this. There's so many nuances here when you're as old as I am, but that I had almost become a yoga monk at one point and studied Eastern religion. So I was very, quote, enlightened, and okay, you can believe in Jesus, no doubt. There's something good over there, but then there's Buddhism and there's Hinduism and it's all of us, they're all pathways to the same place and kumbaya and all that. And so I thought it was very dogmatic. You're going to tell me Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life.
The only way, the truth. Yeah.
I mean, give me a break, and then I thought it was stupid. Some guy lived 2,000 years ago and he died, and that has some, impact on my life today. That's stupid. But just fast forwarding, that's one of the verses that the Lord used when he touched me. It's 1 Corinthians chapter 1. I don't remember the verse, but the verse number, but it says, when man in all of his wisdom knew not God, God in his wisdom chose the foolishness of preaching to save those who believe. Jews seek sign, the Greeks seek after wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified.
It's so beautiful. It's so beautiful.
It is the most beautiful story.
Yeah.
And it's also simple.
It's kind of insane. Like, it's kind of, what I'm saying? It's kind of insane. Like, it is really, it's, I think I don't forget if it was C.S. Lewis or Chesterton said something that was like, only a God in his infinite wisdom could create a story like this outlandish, in a way. It was like, only something so powerful and wise could create something this, I forget the word he used, but it's such a profound statement. But it's your story.
Well, it's so true, Chris. And, I mean, like Jordan Peterson, I mean, obviously this, this towering intellectual. I don't know. I know they're going through the gospel and all that. I didn't listen to all of it, but I know the story sort of blows his mind. I mean, it's, and the thing that's interesting about it is, Yeshua rejoiced at one point and said, that he was glad because God hid these things from the wise and prudent and revealed them unto babes. And I think a part of it, Chris, because it is the most beautiful story, but it is so outrageous that it does take a certain degree of humility to just accept the truth of this amazing story. And I believe God set it up that way. You don't have to be a great intellectual. You don't have to be highly educated. It's just a story that will absolutely transform your life if you believe it. And anyway, so I'm trying to get back to the dream. So just very quickly. So they were talking to me. I rejected all of this. And then my wife became a believer. Now, I don't know if you want to tell that story because that all precedes this dream.
Yeah.
So I don't know, Chris.
I think that's we can just leave it there because I know we could go off but yes. So that's kind of the first thing that happens. If you want to say the hook on the line is Dariel getting saved.
Yeah, and again, these stories. I mean, oh my goodness. But okay, let me do this one. I'm really trying to be quick. I realize I'm not succeeding, but nevertheless, I want you to know I'm making my best effort. But just because this also ties to the whole sexual sin thing and how stupid I was. So at one point, Dariel wasn't a believer. I wasn't a believer, but all these Jesus people, were coming in the store. So I don't know why we decided to do this, but we went to one of their meetings. I think it was like an anthropological experiment, see what these crazy people are doing. And we go in the meeting and, whatever. I mean, there's dynamic worship and men are coming up to me and hugging me and saying, "Praise the Lord, brother." And I'm thinking, this is so weird. And so we got home. And the funny thing was, we started talking about our relationship. And Chris, I had no moral, no ethical, no other motivation to marry. I mean, I told you, it was a big commitment just to be living together, let alone marrying. But we talked about our relationship and we came to the conclusion that we needed to take responsibility for it. This is my wife, Dariel, and I, now my wife. And so this was my proposal. I said to Dariel, okay, listen, I'll get married, but if we don't do it right away, I'm going to back out. Very romantic, and seriously, and why
what every woman dreams to hear.
Yes, and why she ever married me, only the Lord knows. I mean, it was His grace for sure. So we decided. Now, we both came from pretty traditional families. Her father was a lay preacher in the Methodist Church. And of course, I came from a more traditional Jewish family. Anyway, we decided on a Sunday to get married, Chris. We got married that Tuesday. And the people that knew us said, this marriage is not going to last a month. I mean, these are two of the most screwed up, emotionally, whatever, messed up people we know. And our marriage almost didn't make it past 2 weeks. And this is going to bring me to Dariel's salvation quickly and then this dream. So what happened was 2 weeks after we were married, the phone rang. I answered it and it was a girl I knew from before. I turned to my then wife, Dariel, and I said, Dariel, would you mind leaving the room so I could have, privacy for this call? I told you, really smart, and so I missed that chapter, in pre-marriage counseling, apparently. So my wife then went into our kitchen. Prior to this, I had never seen her angry. I had never heard her scream. I had never seen her hysterical or homicidal, but I got to experience all of that at the same time. She went into the kitchen. We used to cook with this big iron skillet, not stainless steel, not aluminum, iron skillet, which we still do because it's healthier, by the way. But anyway, she grabbed this iron skillet. She came screaming back into the room where I'm holding the phone. And fortunately, didn't try to hit me with it. She threw it at me. That is a lethal weapon, by the way. I dropped the phone and I never heard from that girl again, consequently. But and Dariel at that point, it dawned on her that we had some marriage problems. So her response to that next day is she goes to this house where these Jesus people, women were living together. It was called the House of Ruth. This one ex-hippie Star was her name. She actually wanted to go speak to her. She wasn't there. So Dariel's there sitting there. Star comes in, says to Dariel, "Why are you here?" Dariel says, "I've been married for 2 weeks and it's just horrible." And Star says, "Don't worry about it. Jesus brought you here. Just repeat after me." And she led her in a sinner's prayer. She didn't even tell her she didn't preach the gospel. 53 years later, my wife is on fire for Jesus. I mean, that changed her whole life, which is what it's like in revival. Dariel comes home to me and says, "I just got what they call being saved." And my response was, "Well, I wonder if that's going to require anything of me, Anyway, so now, over now I'm getting to the dream. So this was my half an hour question to your bringing up the dream, or not question, but my half an hour discourse. So at this point, obviously there are people praying for me. Dariel is now a believer, going to a Jesus people church. I'm still an unrepentant Jew, doing my thing. And God starts dealing majorly in my life. And there were 2 dreams, actually, Chris. But the first dream, this is how I got saved. And it's very similar to the way God works in a lot of people's lives, Jews, Muslims, different people that have many barriers in their thinking to Jesus. He just circumvents all of that and touches you supernaturally, and that's it. And so the first dream I had, there were 2 dreams that led me to the Lord. And they, look, I've had zillions of dreams. I'm about to be 76 years old in a couple of weeks. But I had never had other dreams like these 2 ever in my life. The power of these dreams, I don't even have a vocabulary to explain what that was like. But in the first one, I was in this huge space. I couldn't see anything, but it was like universe huge. And a very deep masculine voice spoke to me. Now, this is in between the time my wife became a believer and when I became a believer. Spoke to me and said, your relationship. First thing the voice said was, "Don't be afraid. I'm here to help you. Your relationship with Jesus is not right. You need to make it right." And I just woke up, Chris. Like,
that's great.
And I never even thought about it at that point. I mean, it had to be an angel, because that's the first thing angels say when they show up. Don't be afraid. I'm here to help you. Why? Because they're not like the little cherubim, on Valentine's Day with the little bow and arrow that's going to shoot you and you fall in love. They're awesome beings, And so anyway, but I woke up startled, knowing that something had touched my life that was beyond anything I experienced before. But, I was a stiff-necked, hard-headed Jew, plus I didn't know what to do. So, today, if you hear my voice, harden not your heart, but I did. I not intentionally, but I didn't do anything about it. And then a day passed and it had less effect, and so on and so forth. So I never responded. It's interesting, Chris, because there's a verse in Jeremiah 16 that talks about God calling the Jewish people. And what it says is God is going to hunt us, from the rocks and the mountains and so on. And he's going to send the fishermen and he's going to send the hunters, And all I can say to you is, if God wants to touch your life and the fishermen come, respond then. Because the fishermen will throw out the bait, you'll take it, they'll gently reel you into the will of God. Don't wait for the hunters, because the hunters will come, they will shoot you, they will put you over their back, and they will carry you into the will of God. So take your choice. But so the first dream,
I think I've been hunted.
As the hunter, that's you and me, Chris. That's why we get along. But anyway, and we are hunters actually. When it comes right down to it, so there is a connection. Okay, finally, the dream you asked me about half an hour ago or whatever it was. So, and this does tie to what we were talking about: pornography, sexual sin. That spirit is that this was probably a month or 2 later, because I never responded to the first dream, but this is how I became a believer. I'm, of course, laying in bed next to my wife, it's next to my wife. And I have this dream, and in the dream, I'm in my parents' home. They had this outdoor porch that was screened in where they used to have parties. And I was in the middle of a cocktail party. I'm standing in the middle of the room. I'm holding a drink. And in the corner of the room, there's this like chaise lounge. I still don't know a right word for it, but it's one of those things you lay on to get a suntan that goes click, 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 and it goes back. Anyway, she's laying on this thing, and she's absolutely beautiful, but more than just beautiful, very sensual, very sexual. And she's looking me right in the eyes. And Chris, I didn't start walking towards her. She starts sort of undulating, sort of moving in the seductive way. And as she does this, I start being drawn. I mean, not walking, but being drawn across the room toward her. I got about halfway to her, and I said, "No," in the dream. I mean, I just, whatever. I responded like that, and I woke up. Now I'm totally 100% awake at this point. And there's a window probably about 5 or 6 feet, from the bed on one side. And in that window was the face of this ugly old hag, and the whole house filled with this kind of evil laughter. And I was so scared that I clenched, my sides and clenched my eyes shut. And I wouldn't open my eyes for like 20 minutes or half an hour, so scared. Now, my life had touched a lot of dark things, Chris. I mean, demonic things, drugs, the sexual sin. I had been around, I never practiced witchcraft, but I was around people that had practiced witchcraft. But I didn't know the reality of the dark side. I didn't really know the reality of this, God's side either, of light, but I just didn't know the reality of the spiritual realms. That was so scary to me. And I didn't know what to do. I knew that something had affected my life that was, again, beyond anything I experienced before. So what I did, I didn't even think about it. I went back to this Jesus People church, and this was just God. They were having a testimony service, and, people were standing up and talking about the miracles of God in their life. And I got up in the middle and I said, "Look, the Bible says, believe in your heart. I don't even know where my heart is." And I just rambled on a bunch of junk. And, and they called me up front of this little, small storefront church with a potbelly stove, and the pastor of that church and the elders gathered around me. Pastor became a friend later, just said, "We had no idea what to do with you." But they laid hands on me and prayed for me. And Chris, I just believe, I believe I was delivered probably from evil spirits at that point. It's like I opened my eyes and I could see a blue sky for the first time in my life. I looked out at the faces of the people there, and I had a love in my heart for them I never had before. A day later, they took me out in a farmer's pond and baptized me. I came out of the water, lifted up my hands, and began glorifying God in a language I didn't know what it was. And 53 years later, I'm deeply in love with Yeshua, with Jesus. He is the absolute center of my life. He rescued me out of that life of utter darkness, and he is the love of my life. My heart, soul, mind, strength, and everything else I've dedicated to him. And I'm a very, very grateful man.
Yeah, that's amazing, John. I love that story. I think that, there's no question that your marriage is a miracle too. This, your salvation and your marriage are both kind of like miracles.
Chris, I will say this. Now, I said we just, celebrated our 53rd wedding anniversary. Dariel's 7 years older than me, or 6.5 really, but she is 82, and I'm about to be 76. And, because the Lord touched us, obviously we never had any challenges in our marriage, and there weren't any things to learn. And I mean, really, you think about where we came from. We had, that was a joke, by the way, you were supposed to laugh, but, but it wasn't easy. And many of our years together, it was very, very challenging. Yeah. In fact, I would say there were times, Chris, that it was so hard that that if I could unbelieve in Yeshua and in his ways, I probably would have looked for a door out. Now, that wasn't, that hasn't been the majority of our life, but I'm just telling you, taking two very, very broken people and putting them together and having them through the process of marriage, learning, what it means to be faithful to one another and dedicated to one another, and that there's no back door to this. I mean, that it wasn't easy through some of those periods of time, but I can tell you today, after 53 years, we're more in love than we've ever been in our lives. I cannot tell you how grateful I am to God for putting me in this marriage and teaching me how to love another human being.
Yeah.
And it does take sacrifice, and it's not always easy. And sometimes there is a significant price to pay. And the thing is, it's not like, oh, look at me, I paid this big price. It's not like that. I'm thankful to God for working the character in my life that was necessary to be, again, faithful to my wife for 53 years, despite all of this background that I had. It's only His grace that enabled me to do that, but also, Chris, changed me in the process. And I just would say that to anybody, that is in a marriage or struggling in a marriage. This is a gift from God. God's ways are absolutely perfect. They are not a burden. Oh no, I have to be faithful in this marriage. They are absolutely a gift because his ways are perfect.
We're going to definitely have some episodes where we talk, we've talked a little bit about at some point when we move in different directions on what we do here. I think one of the things that, we'll have a series on is just talking about the kingdom within. And I think a part of that, we're going to definitely talk about marriage and just, what we've both learned through that process at this point. So tell me this, John, real quick. I'd be curious, do you have any insight into why Jesus revealed Himself to you? I mean, obviously, I know that's His desire for the world. I know that's His desire for the Jewish people. Do you have any idea, why you, out of all of the Jews that He could have revealed Himself to, is there anything, was there anyone praying for you at the time? Did you ever was there anyone in your family line who believed? Was there anything like that you can see? Have you ever thought about that question?
No, not exactly as you've asked it, Chris. I don't know the answer to that. I mean, that question
totally
opens up. You're kind of in Romans 9 in a way. I mean, that opens up so many different issues. Meaning, the connection between free will and the sovereignty of God and the grace of God calling us and all of those things. But so I don't really know, Chris. I'm sure what I did tell you in the story is, of course, my wife became a believer before I did. And it was about 6 months later that I became a believer. And so I'm sure there were a lot of people praying, for me during that period of time. There are stories I didn't tell you that took place during that period of time.
Sure.
So there's no doubt there was prayer. And I think, I think that, there was also something in me. So I don't credit myself in any way for this, so don't misunderstand this. But I think there was truly a hunger for truth there also. I had looked for, this is just, I think that's more maybe not why God did this, but why I responded like I did when God called me, is that I really, and to this day, I love truth, Chris. That no matter where it takes me, no matter how hard it may be, to have to face it and live according to it, I love it. I absolutely love truth, and I love that about God. I just, I love that He is truth itself. And it is extremely challenging to, these broken humanity, but it is so good. And it's maybe not a great answer to your question, because I think know if I can answer any better.
Well, I think that's a mysterious question, like the one I'm asking. I was just curious if, there's some people, some Jews specifically I've heard say, I later learned that there was this woman who was praying for me, or I later, I had this grandparent who always said this to me, and this kind of came back. I don't know. I just didn't know if there was anything, because your story is so unusual in a sense,
It's funny, Chris, that what I will say is, in Romans chapter 11 at the beginning, when it's making a distinction between the Jews who believe in Jesus and the ones who will eventually believe in Jesus, which is, toward the end of Romans 11, it talks about the remnant according to the election of grace. That was, a description of the Jews at that point, including the author of Romans, Paul, who were believers then. And so somehow or other, the grace of God, touched my life, and how that happens, why that happens, I don't know. But, I think it's in Ephesians when it talks about, how God calls us and he justifies us and he glorifies us. And I thank God so often that he called me, that he forgave me, that he cleansed me, that he accepted me, that he adopted me, and totally undeserving. So I don't know why, but what I can tell you is that I am immensely, eternally grateful for his touch in my life.
Well, okay, so we have that then, and you went on to have 6 kids after that in your marriage?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, we have, one was our oldest daughter who actually I adopted, and then our 5 natural children.
Yeah. Okay. And so tell me just a little bit about, so you were in Pennsylvania and you were going, what was it called? What was the fellowship you were going to at the time called?
The Door Fellowship.
The Door Fellowship. Now, is that an Assemblies of God or what was that?
No. It was non-denominational. It was a church born out of the Jesus People Revolution. That's really what it was, And the man who was the pastor of that church, I think he came from a Presbyterian background. I don't remember, but anyway, I know his father was a sheriff in a small town in Pennsylvania, and his wife came from a Pentecostal family. Her grandmother was one of the first meetings on the East Coast, where the Azusa Street revival had kind of come and moved toward the East. And so it was this whole background, in sort of the Pentecostal world and so on. And but anyway, the church, they were out on the streets, Chris. I mean, it was wild. They had this van those days. I mean, they had this van, painted with, God loves you on the side of it or whatever. And I remember when I was first a believer, we used to go in that van to the local prison, to preach the gospel. And that's where, I mean, just back to me for a minute, you'll probably come to my work life a little bit, but, at one point I was stacking lumber in a lumber yard. Remember, this is from the family of lawyers, doctors, judges, and all this. And I had this hard hat that on one side it said, "Smile, God loves you," and on the other side was written, "Jesus is Lord," and I got this half an hour break, from stacking lumber. And forget about lunch. I went to my truck and I got my Bible out and read my Bible, through that half. I mean, we were
radical, man. You were radical.
We were radical.
It was radical, and I love it.
Yeah, and it's what allows change, Chris. I mean,
it really does.
People were crazy, but we were crazy for God, know, and so he was everything in our lives.
Well, and I love that because, it's so funny because really you made the ultimate Jewish black sheep move and you came to Jesus.
I had done it, I had done it in other ways too,
Yeah, so for sure. So that just kind of closed the loop on the circle of that. So, well, tell me a little bit, I'd love to, because I think, I know aspects of your story that I think we're going to get into deeply when we talk about themes going forward. So I think, we're at about an hour now, but I'd like to take the next 15, 20 minutes and just talk a little bit about how you end up in Jerusalem, and just kind of your process of that first time, because you end up moving over there with your 6 kids.
Well, five of the 6, and then the oldest one, our daughter who was married at that time, came later.
Okay, that's right. So yeah, just talk a little bit about the Jew goes back to Israel. How does that happen?
Well, I will, but to preface that, just because it's really, you sort of have to understand this to understand that story. So the Lord took me. Remember, I was a hippie. When the Lord when the Lord first touched my life, I had been a fine arts major, and I've been living a life where I was up all night painting and sleeping all day long, and of course, I ended up getting married, and it took a while for it to dawn on me. I actually have to support a family at this point. I had previous to this, rather than graduating from Yale Law School, like my closest cousin, I had dropped out of 4 or 5 universities, majoring in wine, women, and song. So when I first had to make a living, I started doing all these, whatever manual jobs. Like I said, I stacked lumber in a lumber yard. I worked beveling lenses in a factory making, eyeglasses. I had this great job that I think lasted 2 days, cleaning out buses, the bathrooms on buses, and then I was a welder and a carpenter and all of these things, and none of them provided greatly. And the other thing about it was, with Dariel and I, we were radical, and I'm not knocking anybody that has this belief, but we did change our mind after a while. But our doctrine about children was, we're going to have as many kids as God wants, so every 11 months we started having kids, and that lasted until we had 4 children, and then we changed the doctrine, by the way. But so again, it dawns on me, I really have to start, supporting this family, and I'm not doing very well. I went to my father, who was a CPA and, head of a CPA firm in Williamsport, Pennsylvania. I just said, "Hey, Dad, if I go back to school and study, accounting and finance, would I have a job in your firm?" And he said, "Yes." And so I went back, Chris, and I went from dropping out of 5, colleges and universities to having a 4.0 and graduating with honors, because it was just the grace of God, really.
Yeah.
And so I graduated. I worked in public accounting for 1.5 years and hated it, because it was absolutely boring. And then I'm really going to fast forward here, but then we decided to move. Okay, back up for 1 second. I'm Jewish. I'm a believer in Yeshua. As far as I know, initially, I'm the one saved Jew in the county. This is Lycoming County. I was
probably all of America.
Yeah, maybe. No. But really, this is central Pennsylvania. It wasn't a messianic congregation. There wasn't one, in the town I was from. I didn't know what it was. I wouldn't know what a messianic Jew was at that point. But some singing group from a messianic ministry from Long Island came through our city. And I said, wow, there are other Jews, that believe in Yeshua. I ended up writing to them, we moved to Long Island as a result of that, and I became the chief operating officer for this messianic ministry. So that took us to Long Island. I'm really going to fast forward. They ended up moving to Texas. I didn't go with them, but I still had to make a living at that point. So I ended up getting a job in a bank, which I didn't know anything about, initially as the auditor. And God took me from there, Chris. And by the way, I was also the pastor of a small little, church that we started at that point. But the Lord took me on a career path that normally would take probably 20, 25 years. In 15 years, from, again, being a hippie to being a local bank president. So that's a big long story. But okay, go very, very quickly.
So like you also, you ended up at a bank, which is also a very familiar Jewish.
Well, let's not get into Jewish, conspiracy theories. Okay, I was not in charge of the world banking system, just so you know. But I was the president of a bank, a Central Pennsylvania bank, and at that point, God had blessed. Jesus was always the center of my life through this whole process. And the truth was, I wasn't that interested in banking, but it was just God opened doors. I was faithful. God blessed.
Yeah, you had 5 kids. What were you going to do? 6 kids.
I had to support them. Yeah. So this was how that happened.
Yeah.
And I was, at that point, I was an elder in this Jesus People Church in Central Pennsylvania. I had been in Long Island. I came back to Central Pennsylvania. We're living on 50 acres, beautiful, 20 miles north of Williamsport. And Williamsport's in the middle of nowhere. So now I'm more in the middle of nowhere in this lovely house on a mountaintop with, again, 5 or 6 children living with us at this point. Our oldest daughter married. And this is how I ended up going to Israel, by the way. That's why I had to do all of that. I felt the Lord beginning to speak to me to lay down my job. And so, I didn't know what I was going to do. And because I was part of this local church, I just went to the leadership there, to the pastor and the other elders. And I just said, look, I feel like God's speaking to me, to resign from my job. Please tell me it's the devil and that I'm supposed to tell him to get behind me, And so, but they all said, no, John, we really think this is God. And so I prayed with Dariel and our children at that point, because we prayed as a family. And everybody said, yeah, I think you should do this. So if you can picture, being in a boardroom, because I was, of course, the CEO of the bank, the president on the board, and, with these white-haired pillars of society, these bank directors, and saying to them, I'm going to resign from my job, as president of the bank and from the board. And they're going to say, well, what are you going to do? And basically all I could say is, I don't know. I just feel like this is what God wants me to do, And so, they probably look at me and say, we trusted this guy with our money, but anyway, so that's, that's what I did, Chris. And I didn't know where I was going, and so over the next 4 months, which that could be a story in itself, the Lord just revealed that, that we were to move to Israel, to found a messianic congregation, their congregation of Jews who believe in Jesus. Not only Jews, there were Arabs, of course, that joined us as well. And so what I will say about that is that the church that I was associated with at that time, they weren't replacement theology or supersessionist or whatever, but I had no teaching about the kind of things that I share now about Israel and the Jewish people, the kind of things you understand, the kind of things we talk about together. It wasn't that at all. When God called me to go back to Israel, it was just basically sovereignly that the Lord spoke it and we acted upon it. And I learned those things later. But so over that 4 months, the Lord revealed that we were to move to Israel. I had no connections there, Chris. We, and back to my Jewishness, Reformed Jew. I wasn't a Zionist. I had God had talked to my wife. This is part of the story too. I don't know if I'll get to it today. Talked to my wife and planted in her heart going to Israel 15 years earlier.
And that was through Derek Prince, though, right? Was that it?
Exactly. Derek Prince had written a book called Appointment in Jerusalem. It was actually Derek Prince, if you don't know who he is, he's a very good teacher, written hundreds of books. He's very brilliant, British, Oxford or Cambridge educated. I think he had a PhD in philosophy. He went to the Middle East to serve in the British military, was on leave in Israel, met the woman who was eventually his wife. A crazy story. She was 20, I think she was Danish, 25 years older than him. Her name was Lydia. She was adopting both Jewish and Palestinian children at that point. But at some point, he wanted to write Lydia's story. And so she only agreed for him to do that if, after writing her story, he would write what he believed God was going to do in Jerusalem in the latter days. And so in the epilogue of Appointment in Jerusalem, which is the book he wrote about her, he does a commentary on the book of Zechariah. And so anyway, my wife got a hold of this book. He had written it in the first person as though Lydia was telling the story, but it was about her. And it touched my wife. My wife's a woman of prayer. She always has been. It touched her heart so deeply that she prayed to the Lord. This is 15 years before he went to Israel. She prayed to the Lord that, Lord, please take me to Jerusalem. And God spoke to her that he was going to do that. She told me, and I kind of laughed, I'm Jewish. I don't even want to visit Israel. I mean, I had no connection whatsoever. And then 15 years passed and we have children and I'm a bank president and all that. And then sovereignly, again, out of seemingly nowhere, God spoke to us to do this. And he revealed that we were to go there. We went in the autumn of 1991 because, we knew we were supposed to move to Israel. We had no connections, Chris.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you can't just move to a country. You actually have to move to a specific place, So Dariel and I and one of our sons, Shimon, went there, and we traveled around and prayed that God would show us where to go. He eventually showed us Jerusalem. We ended up, making an agreement to rent a property in Karam, which is the birthplace of John the Baptist. And by the way, God just supernaturally moved. And I'm going to end this little part of my story with this. First of all, we got our citizenship in Israel when we were there, and that's a whole story in itself. But we did it in Haifa. I remember because there was a torrential downpour that day. It was like water, 2 inches in the streets. And the story with our house, I mentioned we lived in this beautiful house on 50 acres on a mountaintop 20 miles north of Williamsport. When I went to the realtor to tell him we wanted to sell our house because we're moving to Israel, he said, John, listen, it could take 2 years to sell this house because it was a nice house at that point. He said, because the people that want to live out here can't afford your house, and the people that can afford your house don't want to live out here. And so it wasn't an easy property to sell. So anyway, we get our citizenship. We go to bed. We're in the house of a pastor in Haifa, and we got a knock on the door, after we had gone to bed. And the pastor said that you need to call your real estate agent. I called the real estate agent. This is the day we got our citizenship, and we had an offer on our house, and we sold our house that day. Wow. We came back to the United States. This was again late autumn of 1991, and by February 1992. My wife and I and 5 of our children moved to Israel.
Wow, that's incredible, John. Well, I think that's probably a good stopping point for the story, because I want to get back to the door at some point and to just what life was like in Israel for you and your family. And, you had some challenges that needed to be overcome there as well. But tell me this, how long did you pastor in Jerusalem?
19 years, Chris.
Okay.
We started actually in our home, and it was something that we did together as a family. And the Lord started bringing in mostly young people, college age, in the IDF, in the military, and so on and so forth. Amir Tsarfati, by the way, connected to our family way back when. A lot of people know who he is at this point.
Oh, so you guys know Amir.
Well, Amir was close friends with our kids.
Wow.
That when he became a believer, that's when we were there, when we first were there. So Amir and one of his close friends used to come over to our house and hang out with our kids and so on. So it was just a connection way back then. And so
that's amazing, John. Well, I love this. I think that this is a good stopping point, because if we start on the next, we'll talk for another hour, and I think we'll tease the rest of it out as we do this. But thank you so much for sharing that. Why don't you just close us in prayer? Why don't you pray for the Jewish people? Why don't you pray for the salvation of the Jewish people?
Yeah. Okay, Chris. And thanks. This was Chris's idea. Anybody out there that's now been totally bored to death at my life story, do not blame me. It wasn't my idea. It was Chris's idea.
Yeah.
And I love hearing about Chris's story. And I think at some point, Chris, I don't know if we've ever talked about, how you and I connected in all of this, but when we get maybe to some point, we talk about more of this story, we could bring that together as well.
Yeah, so, absolutely.
Yeah, okay. But just thank you for this time of talking with my really close friend, Chris. I thank you that you've connected us together in this way. To me, it's just a blessing to have conversation with Chris. I love him, and I'm very, very grateful for your hand upon his life and all that you are doing in him and through him. And so together, we just join our hearts and with those that are listening now, and we lift to you the Jewish people. And we know that you have a marvelous plan and purpose for our people. It has been quite a journey, Lord, from the call of Abraham till now, and all that you've done with us, the 2,000 years of history before you sent your Messiah, Yeshua, himself a Jew, and his his life, touched the Jews around him, and the Jewish apostles and the original disciples and those that you sent out from Jerusalem to Judea, to the ends of the earth, to bring this marvelous gospel to all of mankind. It's an incredible story. And then, we were out of our land for so long, and now in this wonderful day, you have restored us and continue to restore us to your land in the process, Lord, of restoring us to yourself through our Messiah, Yeshua. So we pray for your great mercy and grace. We pray for millions, Lord, of stories. I'm not going to say like mine, every story is individual, but of you opening the eyes and opening the hearts of the Jewish people to the marvelous gift of the Messiah who you brought forth from our people, not only for us, but for all mankind, Lord. And your word says, that it is your will. Romans 11:25, that all Israel be saved. And so we pray for this tremendous revival and restoration among the Jewish people. You're doing it now. We pray that you'll continue to expand it in Yeshua's name. Amen.
All right, John, that's amazing, man. Thank you so much. Well, guys, thank you so much, as always, for checking this out. Feel free to share, like, subscribe, do all the things with it, and we look forward to seeing you next week.